July 27, 1943. A Tuesday night in Hamburg. The air was already heavy, humid, possessing that suffocating kind of summer stillness that usually precedes a thunderstorm. But the storm that broke over Germany's second-largest city that night didn't come from nature. It came from the Royal Air Force. In the span of just a few hours, something happened that had never happened before in the history of human warfare. Something so terrifying that a new word had to be invented just to describe it. Firestorm. Firestorm. We aren't talking about a big fire here. We aren't even talking about a city block burning down. We are talking about a meteorological event created by man. Imagine a column of superheated air rising so fast it created hurricane-force winds on the ground, sucking oxygen, trees, cars, and people into a vortex that reached temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius. 42,000 people died. That's more than died in the entire Blitz on London throughout the whole war, happening in a single city in a single week. But while the civilians of Hamburg were facing the apocalypse on the ground, a different kind of horror was unfolding in the command bunkers of the Luftwaffe. For years, Hermann Göring, the head of the German Air Force, had boasted that the Reich was impenetrable. He had famously said, "If one enemy bomber flies over the Ruhr, my name is Meyer." He had built a defensive line of radar and night fighters that was supposed to be a wall of steel. That night, the wall didn't just crack, it evaporated. And the most shocking part? It didn't evaporate because of a new superplane or a massive explosion. It evaporated because of small strips of aluminum foil. When the reports started coming in to Luftwaffe High Command the next morning, the mood wasn't just somber. It was terrified. Not because of the death toll, sadly, they were becoming used to casualty lists, but because of what the raid represented. The British hadn't just destroyed a city, they had blinded the entire German defense system. General Adolf Galland, the ace of aces and general of fighters, would later look at the data from that night and realize the terrible truth. The war, for all intents and purposes, was lost in the air. This is the story of that night. Not just from the perspective of the bombers above or the victims below, but from the perspective of the men who were supposed to stop it. The men who sat in dark rooms, staring at radar screens that had suddenly gone mad, realizing that the technology they had relied on to protect their families, their cities, and their regime had been rendered useless in the blink of an eye. But to understand the depth of their shock, you first have to understand the arrogance that came before it. You have to understand the sophisticated, complex, and seemingly unbeatable machine they had built to defend the night sky, and how it was dismantled by the simplest trick in the book. To really grasp the panic that set in on that July night, you have to look at what the Germans thought they had. They called it the Kammhuber Line, named after General Josef Kammhuber, the architect of Germany's night defenses. It was a masterpiece of organization. Imagine a giant grid stretching across occupied Europe. Each sector of this grid was a Himmelbett, or four-poster bed. In each sector you had a radar station on the ground, a searchlight battery, and a dedicated night fighter aircraft circling in the dark, waiting for instructions. The system was precise. It was German engineering at its finest. A British bomber would fly into a sector, the ground radar would pick it up, a controller would radio the German fighter, and guide him onto the tail of the bomber like a chess master moving a piece. It was a duel in the dark, but it was a duel where the German fighter had a flashlight, and the British bomber was blind. For years, this system bled the RAF dry. It made bombing Germany a suicide mission. Luftwaffe Command felt secure. They felt they had solved the problem of air defense. But there was a fatal flaw in the German thinking. They assumed the British were static, that the enemy would keep fighting the same war. They underestimated the desperation and the ingenuity of British science. For months, British intelligence had been sitting on a secret weapon. It was so simple, so low-tech, that they were terrified to use it. They were afraid that if they used it, the Germans would copy it and use it against London. The code name was Window. Window was nothing more than strips of black paper with aluminum foil on one side, cut to exactly 27 centimeters long. Why 27 centimeters? Because that was precisely half the wavelength of the German Würzburg radar. The British scientists had calculated that if you dropped bundles of these strips, they wouldn't just look like noise on a radar screen. Each strip would resonate and look exactly like a heavy bomber. On the afternoon of July 24th, just days before the main firestorm, the order finally came down. The British bombers were loading up, but this time alongside the high explosives and the incendiaries. The crews were handed bundles of this paper. They were told to shove them down the flare chutes at timed intervals. Meanwhile, in the German command bunkers, the mood was tense but confident. The radar operators were at their stations. The night fighters were on the runway, engines warm. General Kamhuber and his staff were watching the plotting tables. They saw the blips appearing over the North Sea, a massive stream of bombers, over 700 of them, heading for Hamburg. Kamhuber prepared to do what he always did. He ordered his fighters to scramble. He ordered the radar operators to lock on. He expected the usual routine: track the targets, vector the fighters, shoot them down. He had no idea that he was about to witness the technological equivalent of a nervous breakdown. The confidence in that room was palpable. They had the best radar in the world. They had the best pilots. They were defending their homeland. But as the British stream crossed the coast, something strange started happening on the cathode ray tubes. The blips didn't look right. They weren't behaving like aircraft. And then, the screens did something that no operator had ever seen before. This brings us to the moment the trap was sprung. The moment when the carefully constructed reality of the Luftwaffe shattered. The chaos began at exactly 0:57 hours. As the lead British pathfinders approached the German coast, the first bundles of window fluttered out into the slipstream. Thousands of strips of aluminum foil dispersed into the wind, drifting slowly downward. Inside the German radar stations, the world ended. Imagine you are a radar operator. Your job is to stare at a green circular screen. A bomber looks like a distinct rhythmic pulse. You rely on that pulse to tell a pilot where to fly. Suddenly, that single pulse splits. It multiplies. It becomes 5, then 10, then 100. Within minutes, the entire screen wasn't showing aircraft, it was showing a blizzard. The operators stared in disbelief. The screens were glowing solid white with echoes. They called it Fliegentanz, the dance of the flies. Panic surged through the communication lines. You have to understand, the entire German air defense system relied on voice control. The ground controller had to talk the pilot to the target. But now, the ground controller was blind. Reports flooded into the central command. Enemy aircraft are everywhere, one operator stammered. The radar is malfunctioning. We are tracking thousands of targets. One famous intercept from that night captures the sheer confusion. A baffled controller was heard shouting to his night fighter ace, "I cannot guide you. The skies are full of Indians." In the cockpits of the Messerschmitts and Junkers night fighters, the pilots were furious. They were flying blind in the dark. Their own onboard radar sets, the Liechtenstein systems, were also picking up the window. To them, it looked like they were surrounded by an armada of thousands of bombers, yet they could see nothing out of the canopy but darkness. They were swinging wildly at phantoms. General Adolf Galland, monitoring the situation, realized with a sinking feeling what was happening. The British hadn't just jammed the radar electronically, they had overwhelmed it physically. The precision tool of the Kamhuber line had been smashed with a sledgehammer. The Luftwaffe command was paralyzed. Without radar guidance, the searchlights flailed aimlessly across the sky. The flak guns, which were also radar-guided, had to switch to barrage fire, just shooting blindly into the air and hoping to hit something. The master searchlights, usually so terrifyingly accurate, wandered like lost souls. For the British bomber crews, it was a miracle. They looked down and saw the searchlights crossing and uncrossing, failing to lock on. The flak was exploding miles away from them. The deadly night fighters were buzzing around uselessly in the wrong sectors. The path to Hamburg was wide open. This was the technical knockout that military historians talk about. In one stroke, the Luftwaffe had been rendered impotent, but the confusion in the air was nothing compared to the tragedy that was about to unfold on the ground. Because the Luftwaffe couldn't stop them, the British bombers arrived over Hamburg in a tight, dense stream. They weren't harassed, they weren't scattered. They were able to aim with practiced ground accuracy. And what they dropped wasn't just bombs. It was a carefully calculated recipe for total destruction. The Luftwaffe Command, still trying to figure out why their screens were white, didn't yet know that the city they were supposed to protect was about to become a test subject for a new kind of hell. The bombing of Hamburg on the night of July 27th was a masterclass in destruction. It wasn't random. The RAF had learned the physics of fire. They dropped high explosive bombs first. The cookies, massive 4,000-pound cylinders that blew the roofs off buildings and shattered windows. This was the preparation. It turned the beautiful, historic buildings of Hamburg into chimneys. Then came the incendiaries. Hundreds of thousands of stick bombs, raining down like glitter, falling into the exposed attics and stairwells. Within minutes, thousands of small fires started. In a normal raid, the fire brigade would rush out and extinguish them, but there were too many. And then, the physics took over. The individual fires began to join up. They sought oxygen. As the heat rose, it pulled fresh air in from the surrounding districts. This created the firestorm. The suction was so powerful, it uprooted trees. It pulled infants out of their mothers' arms. The asphalt in the streets melted into a sticky, boiling liquid. People who tried to run became stuck in the road, like flies in flypaper, as the fire consumed them. Those who made it to the air raid shelters weren't safe either. The fire sucked the oxygen right out of the bunkers. Thousands suffocated without a mark on them, simply falling asleep as the carbon monoxide took over. High above, the Luftwaffe pilots who had managed to find the city without radar were witnessing a scene from biblical scripture. One German pilot, Hauptmann Hans Joachim Jobs, described looking down and seeing what looked like a volcano erupting. The smoke plume rose to 20,000 feet, rocking the bombers that flew through it. The smell of burning flesh and wood permeated the oxygen masks of the pilots 4 miles high. Back at the command centers, the reports from the ground were incoherent. The telephone lines in Hamburg had melted. The local Gauleiter, Karl Kaufmann, was trying to get a message out to Berlin, but the infrastructure of his city was disintegrating. The Luftwaffe generals, men like Field Marshal Erhard Milch, were pacing their offices. They knew the raid was heavy. They could see the glow on the horizon from 100 miles away. But they didn't yet grasp the permanence of the damage. They thought in terms of damaged factories, cratered runways. They didn't understand that Hamburg wasn't being damaged. It was being erased. The breakdown of the defense had been total. The raid lasted only a few hours, but in that time, the British dropped 300 tons of bombs. And because the Luftwaffe had been blinded by the window, the RAF losses were negligible. 12 aircraft lost out of 787. It was a loss rate of 5%. To put that in perspective, the British considered 5% acceptable. 5% was practically a training flight. As the sun began to rise on the morning of July 28th, the smoke over Hamburg was so thick that noon looked like midnight. The city was still burning. It would burn for days, and as the first clear reports finally reached the desks of Göring and Hitler, the blood drained from their faces. The illusion of the invulnerable Reich had burned away with the city. The morning after the firestorm, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, flew over the city. Speer was a technocrat, a man of numbers and concrete, not easily shaken. But what he saw from the window of his aircraft terrified him. He later wrote, "I looked down on a scene of destruction such as I had never witnessed before. He didn't see a city. He saw a smoking crater." Speer went immediately to report to Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. But before he did, he spoke to the Luftwaffe leadership. The conversations that happened in those corridors were hushed and frantic. For the first time, the word defeat was being whispered by men in high uniform. Speer famously told Hitler, If we have another 6 raids like this, the war is over. German armaments production will collapse. Think about that admission. 6 nights. That was all that stood between the Third Reich and capitulation, according to the man responsible for building their weapons. Even Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, the Nazi leader of Hamburg, sent a telegram that landed like a bombshell on Göring's desk. It didn't use the usual propaganda language of heroic resistance. It was blunt. It read, "A catastrophe of unmeasurable extent has befallen the city." He requested the immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel. He was effectively saying that Hamburg had ceased to function as a modern city. For Hermann Göring, this was the final nail in the coffin of his reputation. He had been losing favor with Hitler since the failure of the Battle of Britain and the inability to supply Stalingrad. But Hamburg was different. Hamburg was personal. It was a demonstration that the Luftwaffe could not perform its most basic duty, protecting the German population. General Adolf Galland, the fighter general, was summoned to a conference with Göring. The atmosphere was poisonous. Göring, desperate to shift the blame, started shouting that the British reports of window were lies, that the radar operators were incompetent, that the pilots were cowards. He refused to believe that strips of paper could defeat German technology. Galland, a man who respected the truth of combat, stood his ground. He told Göring, "Herr Reichsmarschall, the enemy is not fighting with propaganda, they are fighting with physics." He explained that the electronic war had shifted. The British had found the key to the German lock. The realization rippled through the Luftwaffe command structure. They were naked. The Kammhuber line, that great wall of defense, was useless. They would have to invent entirely new tactics, new radars, new methods of fighting from scratch, while their cities burned night after night. But perhaps the most chilling reaction came from Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. In his diary, he wrote about the Hamburgization of Germany. He realized that the terror of the air war had the potential to break the morale of the civilians in a way that nothing on the Eastern Front could. The Luftwaffe command knew on that morning of July 28th that the rules of the game had changed. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. And they had no shield left to hide behind. The Luftwaffe was on the ropes, but it wasn't dead. In the immediate aftermath of the radar collapse, a new voice emerged from the chaos. It belonged to Major Hajo Hermann, a bomber pilot turned night fighter tactician. While the generals were wringing their hands over the blinded radars, Hermann walked into the briefing room with an idea so dangerous, so reckless, that in any other circumstances, he would have been court-martialed for suggesting it. He called it wild sow, wild boar. Hermann's logic was brutal. He argued that if the British were going to burn German cities, the Luftwaffe should use that light to their advantage. He told the command staff, "The radar is dead. Forget the radar. Let the British light the target for us." His plan was to send single-engine day fighters, Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, up into the night sky. These planes had no radar. They weren't designed for night flying. They had no blind flying instruments to speak of. The plan was to have these pilots fly directly over the burning city, looking for the silhouette of the bombers against the fires below or the searchlights above. It was essentially free hunting in a kill box. The High Command was skeptical. Night fighting was a precise science. This was a barroom brawl. But Göring, desperate for any solution that didn't involve admitting defeat, approved it. He saw it as a way to show offensive spirit. So, on the subsequent nights of the Hamburg raids, young German pilots climbed into their cockpits. They weren't guided by controllers. They were guided by the glow of their own dying city. Imagine the psychological state of these men. They were taking off into a sky filled with flak, German flak, because the gunners on the ground couldn't distinguish between the British bombers and the German fighters. They were flying over an inferno that was consuming their homes, trying to spot a black shadow against a black sky. The wild sow tactics actually had some success. They shot down bombers. But the cost was horrific. Many German pilots, disoriented by the smoke, the lack of instruments, and the blinding searchlights, crashed. They flew into the ground. They were shot down by their own artillery. They ran out of fuel and couldn't find their airfields in the dark. For the Luftwaffe Command, the adoption of Wild Sow was a tacit admission of structural failure. It was an act of desperation. It was throwing bodies at a technological problem. It proved that the sophisticated, layered defense system of the Reich had been reduced to a primitive, chaotic scramble for survival. And while it shot down planes, it couldn't stop the stream. The British bombers kept coming, and the wild boars were just gnats biting at a giant. But this tactical shift revealed a deeper crisis within the pilot corps itself. The men in the cockpits were starting to realize something that the propaganda broadcasts refused to admit, something that shook the very foundation of their loyalty. To understand the morale crisis that hit the Luftwaffe, you have to look at the psychology of the Experten, the aces. These were men like Helmut Lent and Heinrich Prinz zu Sein-Wittgenstein. They were national heroes. They had Knight's Crosses around their necks. They were the rock stars of the Third Reich. For years, they had operated with a sense of superiority. They were the hunters with the high-tech eyes. Hamburg changed that overnight. Suddenly, these aces found themselves sitting in their furniture vans, the heavy, radar-equipped Junkers 88s, feeling utterly impotent. One ace described the feeling of watching his radar screen fill with snow as feeling like he had been locked in a dark room with a madman. The intercept logs from this period are heartbreakingly revealing. You hear pilots screaming at their ground controllers, begging for vectors, only to be told, "I don't know where you are. I don't know where they are." You hear the frustration of men who knew they had the skill to kill but were being denied the tools to do it. But it wasn't just frustration. It was betrayal. The pilots felt that the technical leadership had let them down. They saw the British introduction of window not just as a trick, but as a humiliation. How could the great German scientists not have foreseen this? This led to a fracturing of trust between the front line and the high command. The pilots began to view Göring not as their leader, but as a buffoon who was out of touch with reality. When Göring accused them of cowardice for not shooting down more bombers during the chaos, the resentment boiled over. General Galland later wrote that the trust in the leadership received a blow from which it never recovered. The pilots knew the truth. They were flying obsolete tactics against an enemy that was evolving faster than they could adapt. And there was another, darker realization. As they flew over Hamburg, they could see the destruction. These weren't military targets being hit. These were their people. The illusion that the war was a chivalrous duel between airmen vanished. They were witnessing the systematic extermination of their cities. This changed the nature of the fight. It wasn't about medals anymore. It was about revenge. But revenge is a sloppy motivator. It makes you reckless. And recklessness in the night sky usually leads to a grave. But if the pilots were angry, the civilians they were supposed to be protecting were something else entirely. They were waking up to a new reality, one that Joseph Goebbels was desperately trying to suppress. The firestorm in Hamburg created a new demographic in Germany, the Ausgebombten, the bombed out. Overnight, 1 million people became homeless refugees in their own country. They streamed out of the city, carrying suitcases, pushing prams, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wide with the Hamburg stare, a look of shell-shocked horror. This was a nightmare for the Nazi propaganda machine. Goebbels had spent years telling the German people that they were winning. He had controlled the newsreels, the newspapers, the radio. But you cannot censor 1 million refugees. These people spread out across Germany, taking trains to Bavaria, to Saxony, to the countryside. And everywhere they went, they told their stories. They talked about the asphalt boiling. They talked about the bodies shriveled to the size of dolls. They talked about the Luftwaffe being nowhere to be seen. This was the, quote, defeatism that the Gestapo feared most. It was a viral transmission of truth that bypassed the censors. The Luftwaffe Command knew this was happening. They received reports from regional commanders stating that the population's faith in the Air Force had collapsed. In some towns, Luftwaffe personnel were advised not to wear their uniforms in public because civilians would spit on them or throw stones. Imagine being a Luftwaffe officer in 1943. You are the elite. You are supposed to be the shield of the nation. And now, your own people look at you with contempt. They look at the sky and ask, "Where are you?" Goebbels tried to spin it. He called the raids terror attacks and promised retaliation. He tried to use the destruction to rally the people, to create a spirit of defiance. But for the people of Hamburg, and for the people of Berlin and Cologne who saw the refugees arriving, the message was clear. The state cannot protect us. The Luftwaffe leadership realized that they were fighting a two-front war. One front was against the RAF bombers in the sky. The other front was against the crumbling morale of their own population. And they were losing both. This pressure forced them to make irrational decisions. They pulled aircraft from the Eastern Front, weakening the line against the Soviet Union, to try and bolster the defense of the Reich. They threw untrained pilots into the fray. They prioritized political optics over military strategy. But the cruelest irony of all was that the Luftwaffe command actually knew about window long before the British used it. They had the technology themselves. So why were they so helpless? The answer lies in one of the most baffling, secretive decisions of the entire war. Here is the secret that makes the Hamburg disaster even more tragic for the Germans. They had invented window first. Years before the Hamburg raid, German technicians had discovered that dropping metal strips could jam radar. They called their version Dupel, named after the estate near Berlin, where they tested it. They knew exactly how effective it was. They knew it could blind a radar system completely. So why didn't they prepare for it? Why didn't they develop countermeasures? Because Hermann Göring forbade it. The logic was terrified and defensive. Göring and the Luftwaffe High Command reasoned that if they used Dupel against the British would capture the strips, figure out what they were, and use them back against Germany. Since Germany had more to lose from a bombing campaign than Britain did, they decided to bury the secret. They ordered all research on Dupel to cease. They destroyed the reports. They strictly prohibited anyone from discussing the vulnerability of German radar to chaff. They essentially put their fingers in their ears and hoped the British were too stupid to figure out the physics of radar waves. When the British finally used window over Hamburg, the German scientists weren't surprised. They were horrified because their worst nightmare, the one they had suppressed for 2 years, had come true. General Wolfgang Martini, the Luftwaffe's signals chief, had to stand before his superiors and admit that they had known this was possible all along. The anger in the room was palpable. They had wasted 2 years where they could have been developing new radar frequencies or anti-jamming techniques. Instead, they had bet the survival of the Reich on the hope that the enemy wouldn't learn basic physics. This revelation shattered the intellectual arrogance of the Luftwaffe. They realized that their secrecy had been their undoing. They had been beaten not by a superior invention, but by their own fear of innovation. Now, the German scientists were in a frantic race to catch up. They started trying to modify the Würzburg radars. They looked for ways to use the Doppler effect to distinguish moving aircraft from the floating strips of foil. They began the Wizard War, a high-stakes game of electronic cat and mouse that would last until the end of the war. But in July 1943, science couldn't help them fast enough. The British weren't done with Hamburg. They came back 2 nights later, and then again. The relentless nature of the attack revealed that this wasn't just a raid. It was an execution. The horror of Hamburg wasn't that it happened once. It was that it kept happening. The British returned on the night of July 29th, then again on August 2nd. This was Operation Gomorrah, and it lived up to its biblical name. For the Luftwaffe ground crews and pilots, this sustained tempo was breaking them physically. You have to understand the exhaustion. A night fighter pilot would fly 2 or 3 sorties a night, landing on dark runways, refueling, taking off again into the soup of electronic jamming. They were living on methamphetamine, pervitin, and adrenaline. The mechanics were working 20-hour shifts, repairing bullet holes and engine trouble, often while their own airfields were being bombed. The command staff was awake for days on end, trying to coordinate a defense that was crumbling in real time. After the second major raid, the one that caused the Great Firestorm, a strange lethargy settled over the defenders. It was the exhaustion of the inevitable. When the sirens wailed for the third time in a week, there was a sense of, here we go again. The British were rotating their crews. They had thousands of fresh airmen. The Germans were using the same depleted roster night after night. The attrition was grinding them down. But the most damaging blow was the realization that the British could destroy a city at will. Before Hamburg, the Luftwaffe believed they could inflict enough casualties to make the raids too expensive for the Allies. They aimed for a 5 to 10% shoot-down rate. They believed that if they shot down enough bombers, the British would stop. Hamburg proved that math wrong. Even if the Luftwaffe shot down 20 or 30 planes, it didn't matter if 700 got through and burned the city to the ground. The exchange rate had shifted. The cost of losing a city was infinitely higher than the cost of losing a few bombers. Field Marshal Milch looked at the production charts and realized the terrible truth. The British could build bombers faster than Germany could rebuild cities. It was a war of production, and Germany was losing. This realization led to a strange phenomenon in the bunkers. Silence. The blustering confidence of 1940 was gone. In its place was a cold, hard professionalism, the professionalism of men trying to manage a disaster. They stopped talking about victory. They started talking about survival. And at the top of this crumbling pyramid sat Hermann Göring, a man whose reaction to the crisis would go down in history as a study in delusion. While Hamburg smoldered and his generals scrambled for solutions, Hermann Göring retreated into a fantasy world. His behavior during this week is almost impossible to believe, but it is well documented. Instead of taking responsibility for the failure of the radar network or the suppression of the Duple research, Göring lashed out at the weather. He blamed the clear skies for helping the British. He blamed the flak gunners for not shooting accurately enough. But his most infamous reaction was his treatment of General Galland. In a heated meeting, Göring looked Galland in the eye and said, "The British bombers cannot possibly have reached Hamburg with such precision. It is impossible." Galland, confused, asked what the Reichsmarschall meant. The city was gone. The evidence was irrefutable. Göring replied, "I officially decide that they were not there." Think about that for a second. The head of the Air Force, faced with the total destruction of a major city, simply decided. It hadn't happened the way the experts said it had. He claimed the British must have just gotten lucky, or that sabotage was involved. He refused to accept that the enemy was technically superior. He then threatened to strip the medals from the night fighter crews. He called them cowards. He said they were flying too safely, that they weren't engaging the enemy close enough. This was said to men who were dying in droves, flying blind into their own flak barrages. This behavior severed the last threads of loyalty between the Luftwaffe and its commander. The generals began to ignore his orders or interpret them loosely. They realized that Göring was no longer fighting the war. He was fighting to save his own neck with Hitler. Hitler, for his part, refused to even visit Hamburg. He stayed in his headquarters, refusing to look at the photos of the destruction. He didn't want his genius tainted by the reality of failure, so the Luftwaffe command was essentially headless. The professional officers, Galland, Milch, Kamhuber, were left to fight the war on their own, trying to patch the holes in the defense while their boss played make-believe. They knew they needed a technological fix, and fast. The Wild Sow was a stopgap. They needed to see in the dark again. This desperation birthed a new generation of German ingenuity, driven not by ambition, but by the terror of annihilation. Desperation is a powerful engine for innovation. In the weeks following Hamburg, the German electronics industry, led by companies like Telefunken, went into overdrive. They had to solve the window problem. They discovered something interesting. The British window strips were cut to a specific length to jam the Würzburg radar frequency. But if the Germans could change the frequency or use a different method of detection, the window might be less effective. They developed a system called Naxos. It was a passive radar detector. Instead of sending out a pulse that could be jammed, Naxos listened. It listened for the signals coming from the British bombers, specifically the H-2S radar sets the British used to navigate. It was a brilliant countermove. The British bombers were flying with their radars on to see the ground. The German night fighters, equipped with Naxos, could sniff these signals like bloodhounds. They could home in on the bomber stream without needing their own ground radar to guide them. They also developed Schrage music, jazz music. This was a configuration of upward-firing cannons mounted on the back of the night fighters. The pilots would fly underneath the British bombers where there were no gun turrets and fire upward into the fuel tanks. It was invisible, deadly, and terrifying for the British crews, who would suddenly see a wing blow off without ever seeing the attacker. These innovations showed that the Luftwaffe wasn't dead. It was adapting. The cat-and-mouse game became lethal. For every move the British made, the Germans countered. The British used window. The Germans used Naxos. The British switched frequencies. The Germans switched too. But there was a problem with this technological race. It took time, it took resources, and it took factories. And guess what the British and Americans were bombing? The factories. Telefunken production lines were hit. Ball bearing plants were hit. The intricate supply chain needed to build these advanced radar sets was being smashed link by link. The Luftwaffe Command found themselves in a catch-22. To stop the bombers, they needed new radar. To build new radar, they needed the factories. But the factories were being destroyed because they couldn't stop the bombers. This cycle of destruction ground the Luftwaffe down. They were winning small technical victories, but losing the industrial war. And as the equipment shortages mounted, the command staff began to realize that no gadget, no matter how clever, could save them from the sheer weight of Allied numbers. This realization brought about a profound moral crisis among the officer corps. They weren't just questioning the war's outcome, they were questioning the meaning of their duty. By late 1943, a quiet, corrosive thought began to spread through the Luftwaffe High Command. It was never written down in official orders, but it lived in the glances exchanged between officers and the hushed conversations in the mess halls. The thought was this: are we just delaying the inevitable? Asterisk before Hamburg, the concept of total war was a propaganda slogan. It meant the entire nation working for victory. After Hamburg, the Luftwaffe leadership realized what total war actually meant for Germany. It meant total destruction. It meant that the Allies were willing to burn every single German city to the ground to force a surrender. Generals like Kammhuber and Galland looked at the map. They saw the American 8th Air Force bombing by day and the British RAF bombing by night. It was round-the-clock bombing. There was no respite. The moral crisis came from the realization that they could not fulfill their primary oath, to protect the fatherland. A military force exists to shield its people. When it can no longer do that, its existence becomes questionable. Some officers began to privately suggest that a political solution was needed. They hinted that the war could not be won militarily. But in Nazi Germany, such talk was treason. It meant a firing squad. So they were trapped. They had to keep fighting a war they knew was lost, feeding young pilots into the meat grinder to buy a few more weeks for a regime that was dragging the country into the abyss. This cognitive dissonance, knowing the truth but having to act the lie, wore them down. Suicide rates among the officer corps spiked. Alcoholism became rampant. The stress was unbearable. And it wasn't just the generals. The ground crews, the men loading the ammunition and fueling the planes, they saw it too. They saw the planes coming back riddled with holes, carrying dead pilots. They saw the number of returning planes dropping. They saw the victory marks on the rudders being painted over with fresh camouflage because the planes were replaced so often. The Luftwaffe was hollowing out from the inside. The shiny, arrogant veneer of 1940 was gone, replaced by a grim, fatalistic determination. They would fight because they had no other choice. They would fight because the alternative, surrender, was too terrifying to contemplate, given the propaganda about what the Allies would do to them. But while the soldiers wrestled with their consciences, the technocrats were wrestling with the hard numbers. and the numbers coming out of Hamburg were spelling disaster for the German war machine. Albert Speer, the architect of the German war economy, was perhaps the only man who truly understood the mathematical impact of Hamburg. While Göring was playing with metals and Hitler was moving imaginary armies on a map, Speer was looking at the spreadsheets. Hamburg wasn't just a residential city. It was an industrial heart. It housed the Blom and Voss shipyards, which built the U-boats that were Germany's only hope of starving Britain. It housed factories for diesel engines, aircraft parts, and precision optics. The firestorm didn't just kill workers, it dehoused the workforce. A factory might survive the bombing, but if the 5,000 workers who operated it were dead or had fled to the countryside because their homes were ash, that factory was useless. Speer noted that production in Hamburg dropped by nearly 40% in the weeks following the raid. But the scarier statistic was the multiplier effect. Parts made in Hamburg were needed for tanks built in Berlin and planes built in Munich. When Hamburg stopped producing, assembly lines all over Europe ground to a halt. Speer rushed to Hitler with a desperate proposal. He demanded that the fighter production be prioritized above all else. He argued that they should stop building bombers entirely and focus solely on defensive fighters to stop the raids. We must put a roof over Germany, he argued, but Hitler, obsessed with retaliation, refused. He wanted bombers to strike back at London. He wanted vengeance weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets. He viewed defensive weapons as defeatist. This strategic blindness drove Speer to despair. He knew that every U-boat not built, every ball bearing not shipped, shortened the war. He began to disperse industry, moving factories into caves, mines, and forests. This was a massive logistical undertaking that sapped even more resources. Hamburg had forced the German economy underground. It turned the Reich into a troglodyte state, hiding in the dark to build its weapons. The Luftwaffe Command knew that this dispersal made logistics a nightmare. Delays increased. Quality decreased. The Hamburg raid had achieved what a major land battle could not. It had strangled the German supply chain. The Luftwaffe wasn't just running out of pilots. They were running out of the high-quality planes needed to fight. And as the quality dropped, the death toll rose. But the most gruesome job didn't belong to the factory workers. It belonged to the Bergungstruppen, the recovery squads, who had to go into the ruins of Hamburg when the ground was finally cool enough to walk on. We often talk about the fog of war, but in Hamburg it was the stench of war. The aftermath of the raid presented a logistical challenge that is almost too gruesome to describe, but necessary to understand the trauma inflicted on the German psyche. The Luftwaffe mobilized construction battalions and prisoners of war to clear the shelters. What they found changed them forever. In the heat of the firestorm, bodies hadn't just burned. They had been chemically altered. The fat had rendered. The bodies had shrunk to a fraction of their size. The recovery crews, tough men hardened by war, frequently broke down. They had to wear gas masks, not because of poison gas, but because the smell of decay was so overpowering it caused vomiting. They didn't count bodies. They weighed the ash and estimated the number of dead by the ton. Luftwaffe officers supervising these operations reported that their men were suffering from severe psychological shock. They weren't just clearing rubble. They were clearing away the remains of families, often finding mothers still clutching children in the corners of basements where they had sought safety. This reality filtered back to the airbases. When a pilot landed his Heinkel or Messerschmitt, he wasn't just landing on a runway. He was landing in a country that was becoming a graveyard. The abstract nature of aerial warfare, where you press a button and a bomb falls, was stripped away. They knew exactly what was happening down there. The cleanup of Hamburg took months, and during those months, the site of the ruined city served as a gigantic memento mori for the entire Wehrmacht. Soldiers traveling by train through Hamburg to the front lines would stare out the windows in silence. They saw the skeleton of the city. They realized that if this could happen to Hamburg, it could happen to Berlin, to Munich, to their own hometowns. It eroded the will to fight in a way that no defeat on the battlefield could. A lost battle means you lose territory. A firestorm means you lose your future. And strategically, The fall of Hamburg forced the Luftwaffe to make the fatal mistake that the Allies had been hoping for. In the game of chess that was World War II, Hamburg was the move that forced the Luftwaffe into a Zugzwang, a situation where every legal move is a bad one. Before July 1943, the Luftwaffe had tried to balance its forces. They had huge air fleets, Luftflotten, supporting the armies on the Eastern Front against the Russians and in the Mediterranean. But the destruction of Hamburg caused a panic in Berlin that overrode all military logic. Hitler and Göring ordered a massive redeployment. They pulled fighter wings, Jagdgeschwader, out of Russia and France and brought them back to defend the Reich. This was exactly what the Allies wanted. By stripping the Eastern Front of air cover, the Luftwaffe left the German army vulnerable to the Soviet Air Force. The Russian Sturmovix began to tear the Wehrmacht tanks apart. The German infantry, used to having Stuka support, suddenly found the skies empty, or, worse, filled with enemy planes. In the West, the lack of German fighters meant that when the Allies eventually landed at Normandy in 1944, the Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. They were all tied down defending the factories and cities of Germany. Hamburg had effectively turned the Luftwaffe into a purely defensive force. They had lost the initiative. They were no longer an air force that could project power. They were a fire brigade rushing from one burning house to another, while the arsonists ran wild. General Galland argued against this. He knew that abandoning the fronts would lead to the collapse of the army, but the political pressure was too great. The Nazi leadership could not survive the optics of undefended cities, so the Luftwaffe died a slow death of attrition over the skies of Germany. The pilots who should have been supporting the tanks at Kursk or the defense of Italy were instead being shot down over the Ruhr and Berlin. The destruction of Hamburg ultimately saved countless Allied lives on the ground. It broke the back of the Luftwaffe's offensive capability. It was a brutal, horrific calculus, but in the cold light of strategic analysis, it worked. The window that opened over Hamburg that night let the cold wind of defeat blow straight into the heart of the Third Reich. July 27, 1943 was the night the German leadership looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was looking back at them with radar eyes. The firestorm did more than burn a city. It burned the hubris of the Nazi regime. It exposed the lie of the invulnerable Reich. It turned Hermann Göring from a war hero into a national joke. And it forced the Luftwaffe into a defensive crouch from which it never stood up. When you look back at the transcripts, the diaries, and the frantic telegrams of the Luftwaffe command from that week, you don't see the masterminds of a 1,000-year empire. You see frightened men. You see men realizing that technology had outpaced them. You see men realizing that they had started a fire that they could not put out. Window was just strips of aluminum, but it was the catalyst that unraveled a superpower. It showed that in modern war, a clever idea is worth more than 1,000 tanks. The irony is that Hermann Göring's famous boast came true, in a twisted way. He said, "If one enemy bomber flies over the Ruhr, my name is Meyer." By 1945, the joke in the bomb shelters of Berlin was to ask, "Is the siren sounding?" And the answer would be, "Yes, here comes Meyer's hunting horn." The Luftwaffe command said many things when Hamburg burned. They blamed the weather. They blamed the pilots. They blamed the traitors. But in their quietest moments, staring at the red glow on the horizon, they said nothing. Because there are no words for the realization that you have lost everything. The firestorm of Hamburg was the beginning of the end. And for the men who were supposed to stop it, it was the moment they realized that history had already judged them, and the verdict was guilty, defeated, and burning.